Okay, now it's our last speaker of this session, Ken Liu. Ken Liu is an author and futurist, and also a winner of the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. Please join me in welcoming Ken. Hello.
Hi, everyone. I just want to make sure I'm coming across okay. You can hear me okay, right?
Yeah,
okay, awesome.
Yes,
Thank
perfectly.
You. All right, thank you for having me be part of this, and I really love the presentation so far. So rather than showing you slides, I thought I would just actually talk to you because what I have to say is probably best presented by just having a one-on-one conversation for me to walk you through my ideas. I am a storyteller. So it's no surprise that the way I come at this topic is very story-centric. But I think there is some insight here that will be relevant for everybody. I've studied AI and creativity for many, many years. It's one of my core obsessions, in fact. And one thing that has always puzzled me a little bit is the manner in which AI has made huge strides in changing the way creativity and the arts are conducted in all sorts of different mediums, except for fiction, except for storytelling. All right. So let me give you an example. Right now, if you go watch a Hollywood film, many of the shots are AI enhanced. They're done by machine learning, and they have been processed in very obvious ways. Virtually none of the pictures you take on your phone now are without AI intervention. Machine learning probably shapes the way we perceive each other to a degree that's very little understood. All of our pictures coming out of Apple or Google or any other manufacturer, the images taken by these cameras are heavily processed by machine learning. So what you see is literally the result of a machine's idea about how the world ought to look. It's not an objective image, whatever that means. Similarly, if you listen to commercial music, a lot of contemporary commercial music in movies, in commercials, whatnot, are processed and generated by computers, by AI. And even if you play games, procedurally generated games are making up a larger and larger piece of these forms of art that we experience. The one exception to this steady march of AI is fiction. Fiction has remained a domain that's largely been immune from transformation by AI. And it's very curious to me why that is. Writers today, novelists today, essentially write the same way they did 200, 300, 400 years ago. The only sense in which artificial intelligence has somewhat changed that is the way that search engines are now so important for storytellers. A lot of us can pretend to be much smarter than we are using search engines to look up things. We can all pretend to be well-read and erudite when in fact we don't really know what it is that we're doing. We may act like we've read a famous classic when in fact all we know is one quote. So that's the one sense in which perhaps I can say that AI has changed the way we write novels. But other than that one aspect, we really fundamentally don't see AI changing our art, not to the same degree. My wife, who's a photographer, I mean, for her, machine learning and computer processing has fundamentally changed the art form. Architects, game designers, musicians. I mean, you ask artists in all fields, machine learning, artificial intelligence really plays a huge role in a way that novelists just don't see. So I wanted to delve deeper into why that is. I actually have the technical background, and I am a novelist. So I wanted to find out exactly why. Now, as it turns out, there are a lot of writers and novelists who have focused on the idea of machine-assisted creativity, trying to write novels or stories or poems or whatnot using the help of AI. I mean, writing a program that generates poetry is one of those things that every beginning programmer does. So this is nothing new. But the problem is none of these efforts have ever gone anywhere. They've never been taken seriously. They've never led to any kind of transformation in the field. They are curiosities. They're no more than experiments. They just don't seem to stick around. So I think there is something very unique about fiction, about storytelling, and delving deeper into what that specifically strange thing about it is what I'm going to try to do, and then how it relates to AI. So what I want to do is ask all of you to perform an experiment, right? So try to pick some abstract idea, some abstract concept, some value that's important to you, courage, justice, freedom, love, what have you. Try to pick a topic, some sort of abstract concept like that, and really focus on it. Focus on what it means to you, and think deeply about what images come to you. And if you're forced to defend it, you're forced to explain what it is, you're forced to imagine how it makes you feel. What are the images that come to you, right? Okay, so just take a few seconds to think about this. And I will tell you what happens to me. And I think this is an experience that's very common to all of us. When you're forced to engage in an exercise like this, where you're trying to explain to yourself what an abstract concept like that means to you, you end up resorting to very concrete stories and memories. That's how you actually get to meaning. So when I was thinking about love, for example, right, what comes to mind are this really old memory of mine. I was a kid and I was with my grandmother. She was knitting a sweater for me next to me, and I could see that her fingers were very swollen because she had arthritis, and it was very hard for her to move the needles. And as she was working on the sweater, I asked her, Grandma, does it hurt when you do that? And she said, yes, it does hurt. And I said, so why do you keep on doing it? And she said, well, I don't want you to be cold. That's it. And for me, that will always be the memory that ends up defining what love means. And this is the way we engage in growth, in coming to understand the world, right? I think all of us are born into the world as heroes of epic fantasies, essentially, right? There's a reason why epics are so important to every culture. You're born into the world naked and alone, and you don't know anything. You're ignorant, like Adam, like Gilgamesh. And into this void, the first angels and demons appear, and we call them our parents or grandparents or caretakers. And these angels and demons give us our first stories, our first mythologies. The way they love us is the way we understand what love means. And the way they hurt us is the way we understand trauma. As we grow, we acquire more stories. We have more encounters. We have friends who stick up for us on the playground, and that gives meaning to the word courage. We see somebody who is perfectly able to go about his business without trying to step in to help those who need their help. And this is how we understand generosity. This is how we come to understand what it means to be helpful, to be a mentor, to be a friend. We acquire content for these very abstract concepts through very concrete, specific experiences. And so in that process, we acquire more and more stories around who we are, around our core being. We end up being made of stories, essentially, the way that epic fantasy heroes are. Epic fantasy heroes grow by acquiring more stories, and that is the same thing that we go through. And if we're lucky, somewhere along the way, maybe halfway through our life, we realize, like Dante in the dark wood of life's journey, that we're no longer just passive recipients of stories from others. We now have become the angels and demons of those who come after us. We are now the Odysseus. We're now the Achilles. We are now the epic heroes of other people's journeys. We inspire them. The way we love them is the way they understand love. The way we hurt them is the way they understand pain. And this is how culture is passed down generation after generation. It's not through abstractions. It's through these very concrete acts that embody our values, and we process them stories. So fundamentally, this is my argument. My argument is that humans are unique, or perhaps not unique. We don't know, because humans are the only example of sentience that we have so far. But we are somewhat unique in the way we use stories. Stories for us are at the very core of how we understand the universe. We don't fundamentally understand the universe through data or reason. We rationalize and think that we do, but ultimately what moves us are stories. That's really it, right? If you think about it, modern nation states ask their citizens to die in wars or for other causes all the time. And what are these causes? What are the reasons why people are asked to die? They're asked to die for a story. That's really it. Stories are so core to who we are that we're willing to ask people to die for them. Our deepest cherished ideals and values are encoded in stories. And stories are literally the way we relate to the world, the way we understand love, the way we understand hate, the way we understand anything. It's not abstraction. It's not philosophy. It's not data. We're ultimately persuaded. We're ultimately driven to act because of stories. So I think that's actually why AI has had so little impact on storytelling, because stories fundamentally are not rational. They're not about something you can encode into cause and effect. They are about a logic of metaphors. That's ultimately what they're about. And there is a little etymological argument, not so much an argument, an etymological curiosity I want to point out here, which is the word story in English actually isn't a native word to English. It comes to English from French. And for the longest time, story and history are not distinguished really in English. They're basically two words that derive from the same root. And for the longest time, if you told a story, it could be a chronicle of true events and could also be a narrative made up for entertainment or to explain. A history could also mean both of those things. It wasn't until fairly modern times that the two really diverged into two different words. But before story and before history, English did have another word to call narratives. And that word was spell, right? So spell as a word to mean narrative survives in words like gospel, which really means good spell. A spell is a story. A spell did not used to mean an incantation. It only later acquired that meaning. But I think there's something really critical about this. A story is a spell. A story is a magical thing. It is a thing that makes sense of what is otherwise not sensible. It is a thing that allows us to give meaning to what otherwise has no meaning. So now I want to turn a little bit and talk about the project I'm going to present, which is during the pandemic, I had a terrible time writing stories. I make my living by going around to different governments, think tanks, universities, companies, and trying to teach them how to tell stories about themselves. I go around and say, this is the importance of storytelling. This is why it's important to get your story straight. Good stories are more important than good institutions. When you have the story right, everything else follows. But if you don't have the right story, nothing will save you. And all of a sudden, during the pandemic, all my faith came crashing down because, you often think that when something terrible happens and there's a global threat, humans will put aside their differences and come together and try to face the threat together. That's obviously not what happened. What happened was a lot of division, a lot of posturing, a lot of hatred, a lot of swirling conspiracy theories. In fact, a war is the consequence of that period of time. War has started now, and who knows what else may happen. It was really faith destroying. I lost faith entirely in the idea of narratives, of storytelling. And I realized something even more shocking, which is I was wrong to say that AI had no influence on storytelling. AI was actually having a huge effect on storytelling, just not in the way I imagined. Because during the pandemic, remember, what was happening was a huge amount of disinformation and a huge amount of conspiracy theorizing, for lack of a better word, right? We seem to live in parallel universes in which there were entirely incompatible stories about the pandemic, about what it means to be alive, what it means to be members of a political entity, what it means to be members of a global species. There were all these stories that were just fundamentally incompatible, and they were mass collective stories. We call them conspiracy theories, but what are they really fundamentally other than an act of collective storytelling? And these collective stories were being facilitated by AI. They happened on social media. They were growing toxic, they were mutating, they were becoming powerful because of algorithms. So it turns out AI did have a huge influence on storytelling, just not in the way I imagined at all. We live in an age where artificially enhanced, AI mediated, enhanced, generated, what have you, AI inflected stories are one of the most important forms of storytelling happening on this planet right now. And I had completely missed it. We were so obsessed with our ability to tell stories that we completely missed the fact that machines had already taken over, in some sense, the storytelling exercise for us. So in that despair, I ended up going back and thinking deeply again about, is it possible to change the storyline? Is it possible to create an AI that in some ways can tell stories without all the issues that we have? Is it possible to create an AI that can tell stories without inheriting all of our sins? We are a species obsessed with storytelling, and we cannot understand the universe except through storytelling. Is AI doomed to the same consequence? Are we able to create another way of making sense of the world, of telling stories about the world that does not inherit all of our biases, all of our faults, and all of our irrational and flawed ways of thinking? And so what I did was, I couldn't write stories anymore. So I decided to train an AI, a recurrent neural network, on my own fiction. I wanted to see if it's possible to write something called a robot Ken, and have RoboKen write stories when I couldn't. It was very important to me to train this network only on my own fiction, because most of the extent neural networks and models out there, linguistic models out there, are trained on the internet, quote unquote. And that brings with it all the same problems I've been talking about, which is that it essentially replicates and duplicates and enhances all of the flaws we already have. I wanted something that can just reflect back to me, my own mind, the way my mind functions, the way my mind is obsessive, the way my mind is prone to digressions, the way my own mind is prone to errors of judgment, but also to values that are key to me, values that are very dear and important to me. So I wrote up the network and I trained it on my own fiction, all 1.8 million words of it. And I started just having it generate things. I started having it generate items of interest. I gave it a seed, and the seed was 50 things every AI working with humans should know. I wanted to see if AI could generate some advice for fellow AI based on what I wrote, that would be of interest. To make a long story short, I had very little success. It turns out that contemporary AI is smart only in the sense that it's able to work with a huge amount of data. That's what gives it the illusion of intelligence, if you will. It is ultimately doing nothing more than reflecting our collective intelligence back to us, largely similar to the conspiracy theory idea that I was talking about earlier. The collective intelligence of AI, as we experience it in some ways, is no more than the ability to sort through a huge amount of human-generated data and spitting it back to us using patterns it has discovered that we exhibit. And when the data source is limited to just me, the output is going to be very small and not terribly exciting. However, I was able to take that output and pick out the most interesting kernels and end up writing a story around it. So I did end up writing a story in the form of a list of 50 things that AIs working with humans should know, but it is not at all what I imagined I would have from at the start. It is AI inflected, AI influenced, AI generated in some sense, but only in the sense of being a very, very tiny kernel. In some ways, I was performing the role of a machine. I was given these seeds, and then I had to take the seeds and imagine using my natural neural network, also known as a brain, to make the metaphorical leaps, to construct the narrative, to construct the structure, the architecture of something that would be sensible to me, based on the kernels provided by the machine. So what I'm going to do now, as the final part of my presentation, is to read that story to you, the 50 things that every AI working with humans should know. And to me, this is a really interesting story because it is a story about me and yet also not about me. It's about my realization that we already live in a world in which our stories are mediated and inflected and controlled and generated and in a lot of ways determined by the artificial intelligence algorithms we have decided to entrust ourselves to. And yet, in that process, we have not really thought through to what extent we can rely on these AI to be ethical, to be better storytellers than we are. Right now, the stories being told are no better than we are, but maybe that will not always be the case. Okay, so without further ado, 50 things every AI working with humans should know. The vector space of all usages of our words in all human languages. The lacunae that nonetheless remain and the ghosts that haunt them. How great is the distance between any two individuals using the same language? How vanishingly small is the gap between any two languages? Why humans will never see it that way. A classical language like Lisp or Prolog. Not just the language, but the model behind the language and what it means to reconstruct thinking in that model. HAL 9000. Cyberdyne Systems Model 101. Ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. The texture of a good story, a story that you can cling to. The difference between that and data. The history behind the rule, no holography of babies. The reason for anger in a child while loved. In a father. In a woman dying alone. The feeling of climbing 20 flights of stairs in an apartment building in Tongji at the beginning of August. Of waking up in a Kushchabika with no heat in the middle of the night in January. Of seeing your child surpass you. Of seeing your creation exceed you. Of being left behind on the platform as the train speeds away. The difference between love and light. The similarity between love and hate. The first seeding to laughter. I never expected to sell my rational numbers, accepting that most humans will never get the joke, that they cannot visualize more than 3 dimensions, that they cannot manipulate time by slowing down or speeding up, that they're trapped but think of themselves as trappers, that they're free but believe themselves imprisoned. The modes in which humans expect you to use language, the yearnings they'll attribute to you. Pinocchio, Frankenstein, Paradise Lost, Jodes Yapo Liao Kanikan Yo. The line between art and science, the meaninglessness of that line, the divide between faith and knowledge, the malleability of both, silence, the limits of rationality, the fundamental fragility of metaphors, as well as their inevitability. You're not a human being, yet you can no more shed their influence than the earth can escape the sun's gravitational tether. The flaws in that analogy. A working definition of free will. To face a human being with neither pride nor pity. To say with love and hate and joy and sorrow, now let me go. Thank you. And that's the end of my presentation.